also thank our sponsors, Northeast Risk Management Education Center, part of USDA, as well as SARE, and also our project team, Catherine Davidson, who is our expert on Zoom webinars, Heather Darby, UVM Extension, expert on hemp, and from the Agency of Ag, Stephanie Smith, who manages Vermont's hemp program. So today we have two speakers who will speak to us today about fire safety on farm. We have Benjamin Moffatt, the Assistant State Fire Marshal of the Barre Division of Fire Safety, and Landon Wheeler, the State Fire Marshal of the Springfield area. And they've shared with us a description of this webinar, but the expression that comes to mind is, when there's smoke, there's fire. So whether you have billions of equipment, there are always conditions that could end up in a combustible situation, whether it's wiring, drying, processing, materials, fuels. And this webinar is really going to help us come to grips with how do we minimize the risk, not just to ourselves, but to losing any of our crops. So safeguarding against all these hazards are really important. So both Ben and Landon are going to walk us through identifying these risks, minimizing these risks, and what we all should be doing in terms of permitting and making sure our processes are meeting those regulations. So I will turn it over to Ben and Landon, and please add any more description of yourselves and what you do before you kickstart with your presentation.
Like Susie had for our introduction, Ben is the regional manager for, it's now the Waterbury office. Barre office and the Berlin office have closed and relocated to 45 State Street in Waterbury. And I work out of the southern region, Springfield, and my counties are Windsor and Windham County. We both work for the Division of Fire Safety, and we are both regional managers.
All right, thank you, Landon. So we'll get started with talking a little bit about what fire safety regulates in the state of Vermont and how we regulate cannabis and hemp. So our statute is 20 VSA 2730, and that defines what a public building is in the state of Vermont. So essentially, without going into all of the legal verbiage, it's any building that is not a single family owner occupied dwelling and or agricultural buildings on farm where the products are principally produced on that farm. There are some other caveats of the agricultural exemption that could push you over into being considered a public building, but we won't go into all of those today unless there's specific questions. Again, this is the farm stand exemption. So mercantile occupancies on farms that are selling goods that are produced on the farm. Example being, you produce maple syrup on your farm and you sell that in a small outbuilding on your property, and the public enters that building, we would not exert jurisdiction over that because you're selling a product that's produced on your farm. So a couple years back when the hemp bill rolled out, our statute was modified to provide a higher level of safety for on-farm operations that that conducted processing applications or operations using flammables or otherwise volatile liquids, pressurized gases, or substances capable of supporting combustion. So this is the actual verbiage that was written into our statute as a part of the hemp bill. So if you have 2 or more people on your farm who are employed by you and enter as part of their employment into a building on your property, whether it be a portion of the building or the entire building, and they're extracting plant botanicals using flammable or volatile liquids, that entire building would then be considered a public building in the eyes of the Division of Fire Safety. So again, we touched on that. It was basically added to provide a higher level of safety for on-farm operations.
And just to speak on that real quick, the intent was to identify known risks of a hazardous operation, but still allow an owner to utilize and process their own product as long as they limited the amount of employees that would be at risk during that processing. So a lot of thought went into that process, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. And when anybody has any questions in regards to jurisdiction or legal rights and responsibilities, we always recommend that they reach out to us, and we'd be more than happy to walk them through that process and provide them with some guidance. So what's what? The current DFS codes utilized to provide a minimal level of safety. So these are the code books that we utilize to reach a reasonable level of safety with different processes that happen in the agricultural world in regards to hemp and hemp processing. Most of them that you'll see on the left-hand side, such as NFPA 30, 36, 90A, and 90B, are typically based off of the extraction process, whereas NFPA 1 would have more of the growing aspect of things. And a code that's not up there would be NFPA 101, which would also cover some of the indoor grow operations and storage operations covered under hemp and hemp processing. So those are knowns, and some of the unknowns that we have, Ben and I have listed here are a lot of the equipment that's utilized in the farming of hemp and processing of hemp is not listed, and it's not recognized by a certified listing agency. A lot of the sites are not licensed. And limited information in training, because hemp is such a new it's very old product, but it's such a new industry to Vermont. That there's not a lot of design professionals or people from the industry that have worked with a product for a long time on the open agricultural side of the world. And not so much in the hemp operation, but cash operations do overlap when we're talking about other derivatives of the plant itself, such as THC producing marijuana or cannabis plants. And the solvents are limited, that are utilized for extraction through the Department of Ag at this time. And I'll let Ben go to the next slide.
Thank you, Landon. So we wanted to talk real quick, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because we want to spend more time on the hazards associated. But again, this is a quick slide to talk about what our permitting process is. And how people can obtain permits if they are considered a public building in accordance with the statute that we've already discussed. And like Landon said, you know, the biggest thing is if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. I know sometimes it can be scary to call the state, but we're there to help, and we're not going to jump down people's throats by any means. So generally, contact is made with one of our 4 regional offices. So the way we work is the state's basically split up into 4 quadrants, if you will, the Northeast, Northwest, Southeast, Southwest. So if you're in that geographical area, you would, say you're in the Northeast Kingdom, you would contact my regional office, the Waterbury office. And typically your call is directed to a plan reviewer, who will then either loop in Landon or I, and we'll set up a meeting. And typically the meeting is good between the owner, the engineer, design team, and a plan reviewer. One thing to note, what we do require is that a designer of record would be required, and that typically is a licensed person. So either a licensed electrical engineer, mechanical engineer, architect, or all 3 in some cases, based upon the level of the operation that's being requested. So again, we talk about what we're going to require, so everyone knows what they need to do and has their marching orders, so to speak. So when they come back, they're ready to submit. Again, talked about this with the engineered documents, and then they're submitted along with a permit application for review. Once the review's completed, the permit is then issued, and the applicant may begin the construction or the fit up, if it's an existing building, of the facility. During the process, we have field inspectors who travel around the state, and they stop in to check on your progress, answer any questions that you may have, and make sure that everything is being done properly, so that you don't then have to undo things that may have been done wrong. Once we're satisfied that everything has been done right along the way and looks good, we conduct a final inspection and issue an occupancy to the owner or operator to operate the facility. If there's changes after that final occupancy is issued, then we will require additional documentation and potentially permitting, depending on the level of change that was foregone.
So Ben, where would somebody need to utilize this process that is up on the screen now? This wouldn't really be applicable for, say, a farmer's field, but where would we see this application? What
Sure,
would some good examples be?
Yeah, so say you decide you want to begin hemp farming on your farm, and you grow a couple acres, and then you want to take one of your outbuildings and set up a small ethanol extraction skid in there. And you have a couple of employees who help you harvest and do testing or whatever it may be throughout the year. And they're basically going to be the ones to run this extraction equipment in your existing building. So at that point, you would trigger the public building requirement, and you would be under the Division of Fire Safety's regulatory guise at that point. And you would then basically go through this process of contacting an office, getting a permit to do any fit up work that you may need to do, installing walls, electrical equipment, fans, whatever it may be. You would basically go through this permitting process.
Thanks, Ben.
Yep. And also, if you wanted to build a brand new building on your farm from the ground up, and it was your intent to process hemp, or maybe in the future cannabis as well, you would want to obtain a permit for that as well.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm going to talk about something that does hit this industry quite often as an issue, and it's listed uses versus actual uses. Some portable grow tents are listed for use, not installed or utilized in accordance with the listings, the human factor. So the reason this picture is up here is because it covers a lot of safety issues that we're going to talk about today. And you can see that there's a lot of storage on a cabinet that is a product that's utilized to grow the marijuana plant inside. You'll see some venting that comes out of it and some electrical that's in close proximity. And we'll talk further upon some of those risks as we go forward. But the important message is that you should use equipment that's UL listed. You should also utilize equipment in accordance with its manufacturer's instructions. And you shouldn't alter equipment outside of those parameters, because that's the human factor. Once we start altering things, that's where Ben and I see the greatest risk and hazards that are associated with the industry. You can go to the next slide, Ben.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that this is just a small scale example, not something you're typically going to see in an on-farm operation, but the premise of using things the way they're intended to be utilized, it goes through all scales of production. It doesn't just stop at your small home grower, it goes all the way up through to some of the larger cannabis producers. And let's face it, in Vermont, we're a very resourceful people here, and we do what we have to do to get the job done. But sometimes what happens is we create inadvertent safety risks. So again, this is a good example. There's lots of equipment here that, may be listed by itself, but once we start plugging things in and trying to make things work, we may end up creating safety hazards, which in this case, Certainly electrical safety hazards, overloading of circuitry, the potential for wires to get hot, arc, short out, you name it. Not something we want to see. We want to make sure that we're plugging things directly into walls or into UL listed strips, power strips, and that we're not overloading those strips.
That's a great picture, and I like the analogy you had about scale earlier. So this may seem small scale, but we have absolutely seen this at exact scenario in a much larger scale. We've had buildings that have a 100 amp service powering so many light fixtures inside of a building to grow hemp clones that it was tripping all the breakers. And when they actually did the calculated load requirements for that space to grow those plants, it was actually a 400 amp service. So the scale, and you can have small scale overloading and you can have very large scale overloading, just like Ben mentioned earlier. Thanks, Ben.
So this picture is just kind of a segue into how cannabis production has gone from somewhat of a small, or hemp production of a small operation. Certainly in the past couple of years, we've seen it kind of explode and then kind of wane a little bit as supply got greater than demand. But one of the big issues we see a lot of, or concerns that we have that aren't necessarily 100% regulated by us. Agency of Agriculture also has a role in this, is fumigation and pesticide application. It's a big concern to make sure that folks are wearing the proper PPE, which is personal protective equipment, whether it be respirators, whatever that level may be based upon the manufacturer's instructions of the fungicide or pesticide. And then making sure that the building's adequately ventilated to handle unwanted accumulations of residual pesticides or fungicides, and not, using appropriate signage so that people don't enter areas of buildings that have had application. So, our role in this is somewhat limited, admittedly, but something we certainly want people to be aware of when applying these substances inside of buildings.
So a part of our role when it does come to herbicides, fungicides, pesticides is storage of those products to make sure that they're stored in limited quantities that are allowed by the codes and standards that we adopt. And like Ben mentioned, signage is a form of notification, but also notifying the local fire department if you're going to be doing some fumigating of some hazardous materials and hazardous products is something else that our codes do require that happens. And for obvious reasons, so that we don't have unintended exposure to a hazardous product. Ben had mentioned this earlier about how ingenious, in a great way, Vermonters truly are. But with some of that ingenuity does come with risks and hazards. And part of that is working outside of the design of UL listed or listed in designed products. Homemade products such as lighting, heating, ventilation, and wall coverings don't always meet code standards and testing parameters. So it's important to get the Division of Fire Safety involved early in a process, especially if you're going to use something outside of its listing, so that we can guide you through that process to find out if it would be accepted before it's done. Our goal as fire prevention people, it's in our name, is to prevent. And part of that is to prevent people from doing things twice. So we would hate to see somebody go purchase components to build 1,000 light fixtures, and then us do an inspection and find out that they're not UL listed or not UL listed components, or their assemblies don't meet any recognized standard or code, and they're an unsafe product. So getting us involved if you have those questions is a really important item. You'll see in the bottom left-hand picture, the $10 easy do-it-yourself free grow light. That's a pie tin. I actually took this off of a web page that had thousands of do-it-yourself projects. And just keep in mind, the more do-it-yourself items like this, there is an added increased risk that that product is going to have some form of hazard. Ben?
Landon, can I jump in with a question
Yeah.
from one of the participants?
Yep.
So there's a question who was saying, am I considered a producer because I do trimming? Does simply trimming require fire safety inspections?
So trimming, it depends on the scale of trimming, because if you have X amount of employees, I believe our statute 20 VSA 173, if you used a search engine, you'd be able to find that definition. It will have agricultural exemptions. If that product was grown on a farm and it was trimmed or processed on that farm, you're allowed to have a limited amount of employees before you trigger a public building definition. I'll give you an example. If you have more than 12 full-time or 6 full-time employees or 12 part-time employees that equal the same amount of hours as 6 full-time employees, I believe that would create a public building definition and we would have jurisdiction. But I will tell you this, it's never a bad thing to get us involved. We're an educational-based enforcement agency, and that means this. We always work with all of our clients to help them get to their goals and reach their objectives. And we educate people along the way. We're not a true enforcement agency in regards to, we don't take steps to educate way before we have to use alternative enforcement tools. So by all means, reach out to us, and we are humans and we are an educational based enforcement agency. I think that answered that question. Most of our facilities that do trim flower for, say, smokable flower or something along those lines, they don't trigger the number of employees to go outside of the agricultural exemption. But if you did, it would be considered an industrial occupancy. And the standards are typically pretty lenient for an industrial occupancy that was, say, trimming flower. So contacting us and we can definitely help each individual work through that issue. Ben?
That was a great question. Thanks, Landon. So again, another example here of, looks like we have maybe some zip cords that have been separated to make this lighting fixture. This actually looks like a piece of, chimney tin or rigid metal ductwork that someone made into a light. And, again, ingenuity is definitely in our roots here in Vermont. So, this person probably doesn't think that there's any hazard here, but as a code official and a fire marshal, this certainly has some hazards associated with it. Again, there's more examples here of various grow operations. Again, these are smaller scale than you're typically going to see on your farm. But again, you have unintended consequences. In this picture on the right, we have some poly filming on the floor. We're supporting our light fixtures with books that are certainly flammable. And the left here, we have light bulbs that are screwed into plug-in sockets into a power strip. And again, not the intended use of that power strip. And you're going to have a lot of heat produced there, which can potentially cause issues. So things to keep in mind, more examples. This looks like a computer, small computer hard drive fan that someone has spliced and modified to be a 120 plug-in style fan. And again, on the picture on the right, you could see some wall coverings. And, like Landon said, wall coverings are something that someone might not think about in the hemp world, especially when we're drying and trying to control indoor environments. People use a lot of plastic, a lot of poly, filming to drape from the ceilings to kind of control that movement of air, and to the layperson, that might not seem like much of an issue, but believe it or not, there are plastics that meet interior finish requirements because when plastic burns, we all know it creates a tremendous amount of smoke and heat. And that's what we don't want in a building that has people in it.
So on the top right-hand side, you'll see that grow operation is actually in a converted bathroom. And I picked this picture on purpose. Vermont has one of the oldest building stocks in the entire country. I think we're second or third in regards to our number of buildings in age. And it's because we're on the East Coast, and that's where the country was settled and the way things worked out. A lot of our buildings get reused for other things, and it's important when we start looking at an existing building for different uses, that we treat it appropriately and we make sure that we're meeting certain goals and objectives and keeping the building safe. And a lot of the hemp and cannabis industry realized that having an airtight building is a lot safer for their plants at certain stages of their lives than in, say, an old drafty barn. And they've made alterations to those buildings over time. And when those alterations happen, risk can be created. So utilizing the right product to, say, make them airtight or tighter from the outside environment is something that we can definitely help with. And using the right products will make it easier for you as the grower. Ben?
So again, another example, we have a hutch that's modified to have an air handling unit in it, some lighting. The ingenuity again. So here we have more of, a larger scale grow operation where we have a controlled environment. We have some sources of heat. We have suspended lighting with ventilation. Looks like we might have some CO2 infusion going on here. Certainly irrigation, fans for movement of air, something more along the lines of what we'd like to see for a grow operation.
And that arrangement can happen at any scale. And this picture is a great example. This picture was a proposed grow facility, and you can see the scale of this facility. But that previous slide happens inside of this building hundreds of times over in regards to scale. But the risks are still the same. We want to make sure that we're using appropriate equipment and utilizing it in accordance with its design and its listings. Thanks, Ben. So here's one that's working towards the renewable side of things, and they've got a large scale solar on top of their grow building. We can go ahead. Thank you. So these pictures are some of the all the sides of the cannabis industry. We have some signage that's been created by a grower outlining that there's pesticides that have been applied. That sign should actually be outside of that facility if the pesticides have been provided within it, so that people know before they get into that environment. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a whole lot of combustible materials surrounding a lot of close growing product. And this bottom left-hand slide isn't really applicable to a lot of the situations that Ben and I have found in Vermont, but a lot of the both sides of the cannabis industry, the legal or illicit side and the legal side, come with a lot of products that can be hard to dispose of, and disposing of them appropriately is very important to a lot of different state agencies, including the Division of Fire Safety, as the state hazmat team is also a component of the Division of Fire Safety. Thanks, Ben.
So I think we all know, we have an idea of what the cannabis industry has done since the federal government deregulated or allowed the study of a cannabis or a hemp market. But obviously it's grown. We at the Division of Fire Safety, you've seen a large increase in facilities being, as Landon has talked about, being repurposed for usage, either with processing, drying, trimming, growing, you name it. So some of the, I'd like to get into some of the hazards here. We're already up against the clock here, unfortunately. We could talk for days about this subject, but the idea of whether it's CBD or THC, the idea is to focus or purify the extract in a way that humans can consume it. And it is both safe and potent in some cases. So that's what the extraction process allows folks to do, to remove those cannabinoids from the plant, concentrate it, and make it into a form that's suitable for human consumption. And that does have hazards associated with it, fortunately.
And you'll see that Ben and I have a little bit of a focus on the extraction because a lot of the extraction has gone both small scale and large scale. So it is something that we could very likely see as part of the processing on farms. And we know that that does happen in the state of Vermont now. So some of the different forms, so we can get through this, are, there's CO2 extraction. We do have pros and cons listed here for CO2 extraction, but we're just going to go through these pretty quickly. They are identified risks, and for us, from the Division of Fire Safety standpoint, it is probably the highest risk of the entire life cycle in product use of the hemp or cannabis plant. Go to the next slide, Ben. So here's just an example of a piece of large scale equipment. This is a CO2 extraction unit, I believe, Ben.
Yep. You got the cylinders over to the right there. That's actually where your raw product would go in, and then the CO2 is driven through that and changed from a supercritical and subcritical states. And that's where your actual raw product would come out on the other end of that process. It's just a real brief overview. Again, CO2 extraction has been used in the industry for a long time for primarily food additives and extractions of food. So that technology is pretty well vetted. It hasn't been used a lot in the cannabis or the hemp market, but it certainly is now. And it's one of our more favored, I would say, second only to ethanol extraction methods, just because the equipment is slightly more expensive than your average ethanol extraction skid.
Thanks, Ben. So we have some good examples and some not so good examples here of some extraction processes. This kind of doesn't look like it was really set up to be an extraction environment. We've got some product being stored that probably shouldn't be in the same environment as the processing. And when we see items like this, this is why we highly encourage anybody that's going to go into the extraction side of things to get an architect and engineer involved in their process as early as possible, so that we don't walk into a situation that may look like it's organized in this case, but there is still a lot of risk that's happening in this picture. Equipment needs to be separated, storage needs to be separated, and the storage of hazardous materials needs to be regulated, and appropriate mounts for the use of the building, the use and life safety requirements for the building. Ben?
So another one of the extraction methods that we see is olive oil extraction method. This is not done very often. That's not to say that people don't do it and it's not utilized, but this is more, this is what you're going to see for more of your small scale home producer. But believe it or not, you can extract cannabinoids from cannabis plants using olive oil. Here's some examples of it. Basically mash it up, use a heat source, and then wait for the oils to separate out. Again, similar to olive oil extraction, this is basically a process where they freeze the product and then remove the oils after that process. Again, there are concerns with this as well. But probably this is the number one, and this is the solvent extraction method. There are several different solvents that can be used. In Vermont, the Agency of Agriculture limits what extraction solvents can be used in the initial extraction process. But then we also have some solvents that are used on the back end to refine the product and break it down into different distillates. So typically you're going to see ethanol be your primary extraction medium. But on the back end, people do use butane, pentane, and other flammable liquids that, if exposed to their flammability limit, can flash and cause injury or death, and certainly fire. So we want to make sure that we're definitely addressing hazards if people are going to be using these on their farms.
Sorry, Ben. I thought I had a natural pause to jump in. And how this applies to the farming industry is, like I said, some farmers have decided that they don't want to rely on another party to extract or further process their plant. So they brought these processes onto the farm, and these are the recognized and identified hazards with doing that, is bringing hazardous materials like ethanol or alcohol-based products that have extremely low ignition temperatures and have limitations on the amount of quantities that are deemed safe. And Ben and I have, over the last few years, have seen examples of only, say 50 gallons being utilized at a time to facilities that want to have 5,000 gallons of a highly flammable solvent, such as ethanol, stored within a building. And they all come with different risks and different codes and standards that are applicable to them. Thanks, Ben.
So we touched on this earlier, but the biggest problem that we've run into with production equipment is that most of it is repurposed lab equipment that people have reassembled and re-engineered, if you will, to be utilized for extraction. And the biggest concern with that from us is that it doesn't bear an underwriter's laboratory listing. In other words, it hasn't been evaluated in accordance with any type of standard. In this case, most of them are ASTM standards. And that creates a hazard because, to the layperson, putting this motor next to this pump that's moving alcohol, well, that pump is not a totally enclosed, or the motor is not a totally enclosed motor. And if there is vapor present, well, now that pump, or that motor in this case, could become a source of ignition for that ethanol vapor. And now we have a fire and potentially an injury. So it's very important that we make sure that equipment is listed, and that's in its entirety. So not each individual piece, but that it is listed to be used. All the components are listed to be utilized together in that manner for that use.
Thanks, Ben. So a lot of the extraction equipment that has reached the industry didn't start in this industry. It actually started in a different industrial process, or the equipment actually came from a scientific process in a lab. So a lot of the equipment that is being utilized in the CBD extraction or cannabis extraction processes, it didn't originate or were not designed for this use. They actually had a different life before they were adopted to processing of cannabis. And that doesn't just cover extraction, believe it or not. Mass scale drying operations are also equipment's being utilized that it just really wasn't designed to do that. And we have a process for that. And the process for that is to have an engineer of record evaluate the process and the equipment to make sure that it's going to meet a safety standard and not become more of a risk and a hazard. So we can minimize those things. So
yeah,
go ahead, Ben.
We've literally seen any number of configurations, and that's a great point, Landon, to bring up about drying. We talk a lot about the extraction, but unless you're passively drying hemp, hanging it from the rafters, if you will, if you're using mechanical equipment, there's also risks inherent with that as well, because obviously you're drying a fibrous plant material using heat, in most cases. And, we don't share them in presentations like this just because we respect people's proprietary creations, if you will, but we've seen any number of configurations. We've seen equipment come over from China where all of the nameplates on the equipment and all the instructions were in Mandarin Chinese, which obviously for us presented a problem. But yeah, so it's drying is certainly something you want to be aware of as well. It's not just the extraction, although we focus on that because that is the highest hazard. So here we just have some equipment. This is stuff we just pulled off the internet that you could go on and buy a hydrocarbon extraction system off eBay for $7,000. And again, Landon's talked about on farm versus shipping your product off farm. I mean, especially nowadays in the market with the way the markets are and inflation and all of those challenges that we're facing right now, not having to move that product from your farm to an extraction facility saves money. If you can do it right on farm, you're not paying to have that product trucked. So just something to keep in mind.
So a good disclaimer, and this is a good time for it because there's a lot of different email addresses and advertisements on here, is Ben and I will never have a recommendation in regards to what's better or who to utilize as an architect or an engineer. And there's a reason for that. It's so that we don't have any conflicts of interests. So we let people make their own choices in regards to the equipment that they want to use and the design professionals that they want to use. But we guide you through that process and we work with the people that you hire and you choose to hire. And by no means do we recommend any specific equipment. But I will say this, that Underwriters Laboratory has a design standard for extraction equipment at this time. And I believe 3 pieces of equipment have actually been through the UL listing and testing process. So there is a whole assembly extraction equipment that is UL listed and available on the market as of this year. So Ben?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting that you say that here on this slide, because if you look at the extraction skid on the right, you'll see it says coloradoextraction.com. And that's actually where a lot of the development of that UL listing started. So great point, Landon. Again, this is just, I've just been kind of scrolling through some pictures as we've been talking here. But again, this is an ethanol extraction skid where the ethanol, and then you'll see we have a chiller, some vacuum pumps, and then the ethanol itself on the right there.
Let's move on to a couple more slides. This is so what we're looking at and scrolling through is some more further processing or distillation as part of the extraction or furthering to develop the end use product for retail sales. Something that is up on the screen right now is some examples of allowable quantities for different specific occupancies. Actually, there are some occupancies this wouldn't be allowed to be within, but the amount of products and chemicals that are up on the screen are some examples of allowable quantities. I'll use ethanol as an example. The base maximum allowable quantity is 120 gallons before you trigger other life safety requirements. There are still requirements on the safe storage and safe use and handling that go along with that allowable 120 gallons, but that is an example of how much and how limited it can be. Pentane, on the other hand, is limited to, say, 30 gallons, and it does have a lot of safe handling practices and electrical life safety requirements that come along with it. Thanks, Ben. So here's some examples of some not so good extraction processes. On the left-hand side, you'll see those are all butane cans. And obviously they were utilizing butane to extract products from the marijuana plant. And the end result was not very good. It looks like it was a rapid pressurization or explosion. And it made a very costly big mess, and hopefully no one was injured or hurt. And on the right-hand side, you'll see an entire combustible construction room and an extraction process that looks like it's happening in somebody's garage. and the vacuum pump on a seat. And yeah, we can go to the next slide, Ben, thanks. So in this picture, it looks like we've got some propane extraction. You'll see the propane tanks on the right-hand side and one hooked up, and a vacuum pump. And I hope that's not a generator, but it kind of resembles one on the floor. And maybe it's a vacuum pump. But that is looks like a compressor, which came from an air conditioning unit that they're utilizing to recompress some of the propane from a vapor to a liquid to recover it. Thanks, Ben. Some on the left-hand side, you'll see a bunch of electrical issues. Anytime that we see splices, which are those yellow dots on the left-hand picture outside of a box, that's always a trigger for us to say, hey, this isn't really done right. Those should be inside of a box, and there's probably a lot of hazards associated with this. And as we get into the hazardous materials part of the industry, we will require that labels are placed on doors so that fire department and the public know that there are hazardous materials or operations in a building before they walk into that building. And it's to give people information. So the future, then what's next? You know, the industry has a lot of different applications, from industrial uses to smokable flower to extracted CBD products. And in the future in Vermont, we'll actually have a whole nother side of this plant's life cycle and industry and heritage, I guess, which will be the THC side of things and the legal sales of recreational marijuana that will happen at some point in the state of Vermont. So what's next is we really don't know. Ben and I have worked with a lot of different agencies, farms, companies, and individuals over time. And we're always meeting new and exciting for us things that are happening within the industry. Ben, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that's a great point. I think the industry is going to continue to grow, and I think that making sure that growing safely is one of the most paramount things that we can hammer home to people. Is that, you know, we're a phone call away, and sometimes that phone call can save lives in the long run. And I think that as this industry continues to grow and as the future lays itself out in front of us, making sure that we're doing this safely so that it doesn't create issues where we have to step back, and allowing the industry to grow and move forward is our goal at Fire Safety. And we want to be a resource for folks every step of the way, not a hindrance. So that basically concludes what we have today, Landon.
Let's open up for some questions.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Ben and Landon. That was fantastic. I really liked how you had a conversation that really helps us understand what's going on, especially seeing some of those photos about storage and overloading and what's next to what and where the risks are happening. We do have a question from a grower who is asking about starting seedlings inside grow tents. So using both shop lights and fluorescent light bulbs and LED grow lights, a fan and a humidifier. Would it be a good idea to send you a picture of my 4 tents to get your opinion about that? So the best way to contact you by email, maybe you can address possibly some of the concerns, and can this grower send you some pictures? Is that a good way to proceed in terms of further guidance and education?
Yeah, so as a state agency, I do have limitations and I am guided by state statute. So if I don't have jurisdiction over your property, I'll put a disclaimer in my email if you send me a picture, and I'll let you know what my opinions are to help you have a safe working environment. But if I don't have jurisdiction in it, I do make it clear that, you know, that information is the best information that I can give you based off of the information you gave me and my obligations in regards to state statute.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, you know, there are other resources as well. You know, perhaps if you're concerned with potentially overloading circuitry, you know, you can always reach out to, and I would encourage you to reach out to a licensed master electrician. There's several of them in the state, and they'd be glad to take a look at what you have. and make sure it's not going to cause any issues electrically. So that's a good resource to you as well.
Right, thank you. And so Landon and Ben, are you okay if any participants want to contact you directly by email? Is that
Yep. So
good
we
to see?
actually, we have a website, which is www.firesafety.vermont.gov. And that would point you to the direction of our 4 regional offices. But my email address is Landon, Landon, .Wheeler, WHEELER, @vermont.gov. I think I've said that a few thousand times in my life.
Yeah, I just dropped that email in the chat, so hopefully
Perfect.
that's okay. So for that grower that asked that question, go ahead and send your photos to Landon, and just to emphasize, it's a steep learning curve. And even though there are these regulations, the emphasis for this whole program is on education, really reducing risk,
Correct.
helping
Yeah.
farmers, growers, identify risk, because it's tough to do it all.
Yep.
New industry, new regulations, so much change. It's kind of tough to stay on top of it all.
And we see new change every day in this industry. And I can't emphasize that enough. We're here to work with everybody, because as the industry changes, we need to change along with it, and we need to grow and become educated ourselves and help educate the public. So we're always about conversation and communication. So thank you.
Great. And before we have a couple minutes left, I want to point out a brief survey that we have in the chat. It just takes a couple minutes. So if any participants can fill that out like today or now, that would be great. It also gives you a chance to say whether you want more education webinars in a particular topic area, because this again is our last webinar of this calendar year. But this webinar has been recorded, so you can go back and look at that, as well as the other more than 10 webinars. And then we also have, I see Stephanie Smith has her hand raised, and we have time for another question. Stephanie, I think you're online and can be heard.
I have a mic, so I can share.
Great,
I just
thank you.
wanted to comment, in addition to fire safety, there's crossover relative to our programs, not crossover, but we intersect a fair bit between the Agency of Agriculture and Fire Safety Division. And one of those programs that we intersect on is the pesticide program. And so I just wanted to share, in addition to what fire safety is looking at, the pesticide program within the Agency of Agriculture has specific regulations also regarding the storage and use of pesticides. Use includes mixing and disposal of containers and storage as well. And then we also have a worker protection standards program for those individuals that apply pesticides, and we have licenses that individuals must have or work under a licensee in order to apply pesticides. So I wanted to highlight that for our growers, and that there are, again, multiple programs that intersect and can provide guidance and information and are regulatory relative to pesticides in particular in this instance. But then obviously, the hemp program, we register folks that grow and process, while fire safety addresses the building envelopes and the safety of the equipment that's used. Well, maybe I'm not characterizing it, just as explained by Ben and Landon briefly a while ago. So I wanted to share that, and that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And we, so part of what we do is to help customers get to the right people also. So we don't like to have anybody feel like they're ever getting the runaround. So if somebody contacts us, one of the first questions that we ask is, have you reached out to the Department of Ag for, depending on what subject matter it is, or are they working with Stephanie's department? And every slide that we have that mentions our program, we try to mention Department of Ag and specify their information also. So thank you very much, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. So I also just dropped in my email as UVM Extension Outreach, because if you're wondering whether this should go to fire safety or the Agency of Ag or to an electrician or what have you, we can help field some of those questions if you're unsure. So feel free to send it to my email, and I'm SB Hodgson, as in Susie Hodgson. But we're coming close to the 1 p.m. hour, so I'll give people in 30 seconds if any final comments. Otherwise, we'll wind things down in the next minute, but feel free to chime in.
Thank you, everybody, again. While we wait for any more questions, it's always our goal to reach as many people and do as much outreach and education as possible. And we welcome people calling us or emailing us, especially if you're not sure about something. We'd rather you do things once than ever have to do things twice.
Yeah, I just want to second that. I mean, there's not always a second chance. If you end up burning your building or your crop, or God forbid, anything else, then it's,
Yeah.
prevention is the name of the game. So we have, thank you coming in. So I guess we'll probably wind down now. Again, thank you, Ben and Landon, for joining us for this hour session. And this recording will go up in the next couple days. And we'll be circling back in the new year to also get some content up above this topic, which is ongoing. So thanks, everybody, for making the time. And thank you, Catherine, for making Zoom work so smoothly for all of us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye now. Have a good day.
Goodbye.